We are live. Finally.
That was
Talk
exciting.
about talk about agility.
Oh
Sorry,
man.
everybody. We were yeah, that was yeah, we had let's see, a bad echo problem, Bluetooth problem, operating system problem, had to reboot. That was this has never happened, I think 13 shows into it. So thanks
Yeah.
for the
Well,
patience, everybody.
at least we're only five minutes late. This is the
Right. It's
excitement of,
true.
I guess, whatever I would call it, maybe live TV. You would call it a live call, Dan, because you tend to describe this as a
I
call
tend to
whenever we
use
do this.
yeah, our AOL dial-up failed earlier.
Yeah.
So well, welcome everybody. Wow, we have a lot of new names. Sorry, I'm just kind of getting everything turned back on again, seeing all the awesome names, a lot of our regulars, a lot of new people who I don't know. So thank you for attending. Looks like Michael has a big fan club. I like this. This is good. So let's do a quick intros. I'm Dan Riley, and I am the co-founder of RADICL, and this is our show, RADICL Ready Live. I'm with my brother.
Patrick Riley, co-founder of RADICL. Thrilled to be here with everybody today. And I'm just going to say out of the gate, I'm really excited about this conversation.
I know. Yeah,
So,
this is.
so yeah, I was
Oh,
going
you
to say,
go.
so yeah. So Dan, what do we do at RADICL?
We at RADICL we inspire change.
Right.
So it's funny. I was talking to someone the other day about what do you do at work? What do you do for a living? And depends on the person. Sometimes I say I make work better for people, or I try to make work better, or I make the work a happier place, or I allow organizations to feel more inclusive, or but ultimately we're inspiring people to change. We're inspiring people to bring their best to work. And that's a big part of our mission and our vision and our value set. And for those new to our community, this is what we talk about every week. We bring on guests from all walks of life, from musicians to film producers to CEOs to CHROs to amazing talents like Michael Arena, who we'll talk about in a little bit and bring live with us. And really, it's anybody who is out there inspiring change, who is on a mission to make things just a little bit better, to leave the world a little better place, to make organizations thrive, to make people show up to work wanting to thrive and bring their best. So, this is what we do. And I think, Pat, you and I were chatting before this, um, and what an incredible, timely time to have this Michael on. I mean, we are sort of at this moment where we're coming down on the backside from the pandemic. The world's starting to open up again. Obviously, our love goes out to India and a few places around the globe that are still struggling, and we hope that they can get to a safer and better place soon. But for the most part, especially here in the U.S. and around Europe, we are really coming to the next phase of what we've been talking about as that new normal, right?
Yeah.
And it's not a new normal. We'll be constantly evolving and changing, but things are starting to get back to some sense of normalcy. And so talking about, how do we look in the mirror and continue to disrupt ourselves, change and stay relevant? Now is the time for organizations to be doing this. So this conversation is so timely. I think we've lost. Hey, Pat, we might have lost you. Hey, is from someone in the community, can you hear Pat, or is he frozen? Someone can throw a message in. Nope, he's frozen. Thank you. Um, he doesn't know. I can see him through the window. This is one of those tech days. Here, let's do this. You're really seen. I'm gonna disconnect him and re-invite him. He's on a roll. I can see him through the window. Oh, he's gonna have to start fresh. Here he comes. This is All right. Well, we're waiting for Pat to come. If you're frozen, you yes, clap our hands. Okay, now we're bringing Pat back on. So anyway, we're going to be bringing Michael on in a little bit, and I have not had the pleasure to speak with Michael one on one or in person yet. But he was brought to my attention as an incredible guest who's done some really cool research on adaptive space, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'll do my best to describe it, and then we'll bring on the expert who's created this concept. Um, and so, excuse me, just trying to get Pat back on. These are the moments when you want a producer on a show, when you're trying to self-produce. Um, it's tough. All right. Well, you know what we're gonna do. There we go.
Awesome.
Hey Pat, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, you are
Okay. Good.
back.
Yeah, I'm not sure who.
This is a crowdcast day.
Yeah.
Yeah, we lost you, unfortunately. The
Okay.
community has confirmed that for me. And unfortunately, we lost all of you, meaning we didn't get any of you were talking away and we didn't hear anything. So
Okay.
start right where you left off or where you started.
Allison's bringing some humor to the occasion, which we're thankful for.
Yes.
And yeah, so it's jumping back in. So Dan, I was thinking, as you said, as we're kind of moving back, sort of two things. One is what do we do here at Radical, just to kind of finish that up, and just to build on that a little bit. Our work really manifests around helping organizations rethink their people science as they think about designing for the whole person experience at organizations, right? So we bring sort of a science frame to the work, and then we bring kind of a measurement and an insights approach to it, and we're helping organizations kind of move more robustly down their employee experience design work, right? But the world is changing, and so there's the work we're doing and the expertise we bring to it, and then there's sort of the speed of change that's happening in the world right now. And you're right, we're at this new sort of inflection point. I mean, just as of last week here in the United States, like you said, the CDC said things are a lot safer with vaccines. And Dan, we had the world premiere of our latest movie when we're not doing work at Radical. It's a documentary called The Claw, and it had its world premiere last week at the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Film Festival. And it was a live screening, and it was 200 people were there. It was sold out, and it was just such a interesting moment to be back with people, and having a shared experience. And it was sort of like, I personally have been really reflecting on how that is both kind of exciting and also like, whoa, here we go. We're kind of getting back into it, and I think it's this idea of, well, as we start kind of moving back into some sort of new normal, what are the things we've learned over the last year about how we can work really well remotely or in a hybrid fashion, and then how are we taking hopefully the wisdom through that and bringing it forward, as we think about strategies in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, it's I think a lot of organizations, even during the pandemic, had to reimagine their business, right? Had to be very agile and change, not necessarily because they wanted to, but because they had to survive. So I think we're coming to this interesting place where do you revert back some of those organizations that found new revenue streams? And I have so many questions for Michael. So we'll get him on in a little bit here. We could probably chat for hours, but any way you slice it, right now is an opportunity that organizations have as they're starting to bring people back to the office or not bringing them back to the office. How they bring them back, how do teams continue to collaborate in a remote way, in a virtual way? Has that been effective or less effective when it comes to disrupting change? There's so much to chat about, but I love the fact that Michael's joining us today, and so I want to talk a little bit about what his book, and then we'll bring him on. But I'm going to read something. So this is how adaptive space is defined, at least at a real high level on some of his materials. So to edge out the competition in today's disruptive environment, this is the why of adaptive change. You need to ensure that your company is agile, that it can respond to change instantly and effectively, because fast and furious change is the only thing you can count on in business today. And I think this is, incredibly insightful and incredibly important. So Michael spent about 10 years doing research on adaptive space. I know the research won a Walker Prize from the People in Strategy in 2017. I believe the book was published in 2018. He was at General Motors as Chief Talent Officer for, I think, from 2013 to about 2019. He now is a Vice President of Talent and Development at Web Services. So, a guy that's very busy and took the time to do some really, really insightful and important research. So, I'm really excited to bring him on. And I am looking, before we do this, a little bit more about the community. So for those who are on, and thank you, big crowd today. Any questions you have, put in chat. We will do our best to answer. I'm seeing some of our favorite people that are here every week. It's great to see you again, Elsa, Christian, Allison. You're back. It took Michael to bring you back. We understand. And Chris, I think maybe you already said that. It's good to see you again. Kara, good to see you to our, I think, new to our community. So thank you for being here. Jean A from LA, welcome. So yeah, it took a semester, yes. Okay, fair enough. So we keep it light, we keep it fun. We hope you leave today with some new ideas and feeling a little bit inspired. And I apologize for these tech issues. Hopefully you've seen the last of them. So with that, Michael, I am going to invite you to join us. So you're getting an invite, assuming the tech works. It's coming onto your screen now. So I usually do the countdown because I'm getting so good with Crowdcast. 3, 2, 1.
Oh, getting pretty good at that. Nice job, Dan.
I am.
You landed the plane. Nice to meet you, Michael.
Michael, good to see you.
Hey, Dan.
How's it going?
Looking forward to the conversation. And a little bumpy on the tech, but it's all good, right? That's part of being radical.
Yeah. It is. It's this has been a very smooth platform for us for the most part. But yes, but we made it, and we're here. So tell us a little bit about. I did my best to give a little intro about you and the research, but I'd love to hear it from you.
Well, first off, thrilled to be here. Looking forward to this conversation. It was hard to be silent as you were starting to talk about this virtual work thing. It's something that I am super passionate about. A little bit about myself. So everything's a network problem for me. So I'm a bit of a, I guess, self-proclaimed social scientist, semi-educated, full practitioner. I don't know how I would describe myself, but I will tell you that I think of things as networks. And that was a bit about adaptive space. It was actually discovered as part of the research for adaptive space. And I think probably more pertinent today than even back in 2018 when that book was written.
Yeah. So, sure. So tell us a little bit about, what was the goal? What was missing from your perspective? So, from organizational culture and how organizations work and create and be effective in the, what was missing that really drove you to want to do this research from your perspective? So the why of the research.
Yeah, I think we all know we live in this era of disruption, right? You're either disrupting or being disrupted as an organization, as an institution. Certainly, much of the research is anchored into corporations, but I've done some work with nonprofits and education institutions, so equally the same, different nuances. But we know we live in the era of disruption. If you put it in the corporate sense, right? Just go back to 2020 or 2000. 52% last time I looked at it of the Fortune 500 companies in the year 2000 no longer exist today. So, I mean, just think about that, right? 20, 21 years later, most of them are extinct. So a handful of us researchers were interested in, why is it that some organizations are able to adapt, morph, modify, refine their strategy, hit a new fitness landscape and become successful in a new domain, on a new S-curve, on a new product, and yet others seemingly cannot. And what is the difference between these two sets of organizations? So like that was the core question that haunted us for more than a decade. We entered into it thinking like there's got to be a leadership thing here. And most of the research team were leadership development folks or academics. So we entered into it thinking, there's got to be some different form of leadership. And that's partially true. But I think what we discovered was this has much more to do with the social construct of organizations as anything else. And really, those organizations that are adaptive do some special things and unique things, at least at certain points in time, that other organizations miss or are not able to do. So that was the core question. And we, like any good researcher, we went out and just started, interviewing companies. And I think that first data set had 60 big companies. And we just asked questions about where were you successful? How has this innovation worked? And did deep dives to better understand, exactly what are the dynamics around adaptation. Some surprises, some obvious responses, but I think in the end, it manifested into this concept called adaptive space.
Yeah, really cool. And Dan and I were chatting leading up to our call and or to this chat, and we spend a lot of time working with our clients or when we're talking to other practitioners, thinking about how do we design cultures where everyone's sort of in a position to be able to thrive and feel energetic. So Dan and I really grew up in that employee engagement space. Starting in like the year 2000, we built up a platform that helped organizations kind of measure and think about more traditional dynamics of what makes employees engaged, and then how do you sort of align that engagement toward what you're trying to do in an organization. And now with the work at RADICL, we're kind of picking up beyond that, which is we kind of feel like the world has fundamentally changed in many ways. Organizations have to think about where they live in the world and their position in a sort of a changing world. Two, the other big factor is, which I can't wait to hear your latest research, is the way we're working is different. And so our belief is sort of the people science of how we kind of measure and understand that needs to kind of shift and change too. So Dan and I are big believers of what we call sort of the whole person experience, where we need to kind of think about life and career sort of across that. And there's some really interesting intersection points as we start to think about how we frame things and how your work kind of starts to think about kind of how people actually work. And so there's a few things. One is, if you were talking to a leader, is what I describe kind of first fundamental, meaning you need to have sort of those things in place first, and then you get into the space of OD, meaning kind of like really designing for optimal way that people work towards things. So that's part one. And kind of slightly related to that, like in your book, I like how you talked about sort of the can't remember the three places of work, or I can't remember the term it is, but it's sort of like home, work, and then the third, what is it, the third place? What's the term again?
Place, yeah.
Yeah, and you describe that, or at least sociologists describe that as sort of being out and about, the cafe where we sort of randomly run into things, and you're saying that adaptive space is kind of that, or is sort of that to a certain degree. So anyway, if you think about the way we kind of frame it and the way you're framing it, it seems like there's this really, like we're really closing in on sort of an exciting approach into how things work. So yeah, so how do you think about how we sort of typically frame things? How does your work fit into that? And then how is this sort of changing world we're in, sort of like this, like the Z-axis into all this?
Yeah. I kind of, it's a great question. I kind of start with the notion that the one size fits all concept is a misnomer. What it takes to engage me is quite different than what it might take to engage you, Pat, or Dan. So that was kind of discovered. It's, engagement is deeply personal, and I very much subscribe to the whole person concept. I was taught by Kathy Dannemiller in the OD world, and whole people make whole systems. And I think it's our obligation as organizations to create the space, we'll call that adaptive space for a moment, where people can show up as their full self. Probably one of the biggest surprises in all these organizations, all 60, even those that weren't adaptive, every one of them had what we ended up calling entrepreneurial pockets. Another way of saying that is every one of them had great ideas. This is not an idea problem. There is latent potential existing in even the most adaptive organizations. I think it's our obligation to figure out how to unleash, how to unlock those ideas and how to unleash that latent potential. And for me, that comes through thinking about being super intentional about the different types of connections. There are different types of connections that do different things inside of an organization. And we need to unlock that. We need to be intentional about that. We need to think about where are we in the time sequence of any given event. So I think social constructs, social arrangements matter immensely. And then I think the engagement thing is deeply personal. I'll tell you, like, there are two ways we frame up the book is, every organization had an entrepreneurial system, or entrepreneurial pockets, we call them, and every organization had an operational system. Those two things are in contrast with each other. Like, if you're that person who is engaged by discovering new ideas, building new ideas, the entrepreneur, the radical in your language, you hate the thing called operational system. But if you're an administrator, like we're noise, like we're all innovators, I'm presuming. If you're an administrator and you're trying to minimize variation and you're trying to create successful patterns across time so that you can reap, profitable benefits, like us, the three of us, we're noise. Like, they want to squelch us. They want to stifle us out. The reality is the innovators need operational systems to scale their ideas, and the operational systems need innovators to invent the new, set of activities. And it's whenever you come to realize that the tension between those two things, which is exactly where adaptive space sits, is really what enables adaptation inside of any organization or institution.
Yeah, so cool.
Yeah. So, when you were speaking, something that we talk about a lot, is a company purpose and vision. And, I'm wondering what your thoughts are here, because we know for a company to be successful, not everybody needs to be a visionary, right? But everyone needs to rally around a vision, right? And so this is what number one, this is what we believe. So number two, how do organizations stay true to their North Star and their vision, even when lots of ideas are coming their way, right? Because we can get chaotic and say, great idea, let's try it. Or we can say, great idea, but this doesn't serve the purpose of the organization. So how do you filter out ideas that are more relevant for the organizational purpose and longer term North Star and mission?
Yeah, I think the power of a social system is it self-regulates. So if you've got a crisp vision that people generally buy into, everyone doesn't have to buy into it, emphatically. And there's been, like, I grew up, by the way, the researchers in this group, there were some complexity scientists inside the group, and we had these knockout, drag out battles around the value of a vision. If you're a true emergence person, you think that we're all biological creatures, and through the very set of our interactions, vision emerges, or purpose emerges. I have a different stance. I think that's mostly true, but I have a different stance. A vision is very useful for two primary reasons. One is it gets people moving in the same direction. And two, later on in the process, it helps us to maintain some degree of alignment whenever we're getting into that operational stage of scaling something. So I just think a vision is useful, but insufficient by itself. If you get too locked into your vision, then you're not really being an agile organization. You're not really learning. You're not really enabling your organization to think about new things and to discover new things and to iterate and experiment. But yet there is some broad-based set of identity that will help to siphon out the ideas that don't fit within that identity of a business. So I think, Dan, to your question, Like once people buy into that, and once it becomes, sort of a social idea, and it's not just one person's idea, I think the system self-regulates, and it knows what a good idea is and a bad idea is, and that's the beauty of conflict. I don't believe in a conflict-free world, and I talk a lot about this in a book. But conflict comes late, and conflict is much more of a pressure testing mechanism in order to ensure that we're working on the right ideas, we're investing in the critical few ideas, and they're going to have an impact for our business and our customers.
Yeah, that's I love that, and one of the examples you bring up in your book is Blockbuster and versus Netflix, and so if if Blockbuster thought they were staying true to their vision and their ideas were going to continue to propel them forward, does that end up just being a leadership issue? Is that so if a company does collapse and fail because they don't see, I mean, how can we avoid that? I guess that it's a big question, and I don't expect you to have the perfect
No,
answer, but I'm curious.
So here's the challenge, right? A good friend of mine at Stanford, Charles O'Reilly, calls this the success trap. Like as an organization evolves and becomes more and more successful, all the structures around that success, and all the cultural norms and behavioral biases around that success begin to lock in. Why? Because we want to scale it, we want to repeat it, and we want to reap the benefits of that success. The problem is that's the success trap. You can become locked in. And we tend to think in organizations, as I have traditionally, that the mitigating path for that is to reduce structure, to minimize bureaucracy, to minimize hierarchy and all those structural components. I actually think that cultural lock-in, and Charles says this, cultural lock-in is actually more dangerous. Where we all start to look and act and talk and shake our heads to the same things. And what we're really doing is we're stifling out the new ideas on the edge. And I think that the difference between structural lock-in and cultural lock-in is structural lock-in, you can see it. Like, when structure is stifling something. Cultural lock-in is so nuanced that even the people closest to, wanting to continue to change don't necessarily see the normative behavior that's emerged that has prohibited some sort of new generation. So I think back to Blockbuster and Netflix. Netflix became very locked in structurally. Blockbuster became very locked in structurally, but more importantly, they became very locked into their cultural mindset. Where Netflix, on the other hand, they knew that their first product line was going to be disrupted. They just didn't know how it was going to be disrupted, and the technology didn't exist enough for physical DVDs to be disrupted at that point, but they knew that it was going to happen. So their cultural mindset was, we're going to continue to experiment with our own demise, and we're going to continue to test and challenge. And the companies that are adaptive and have great adaptive space are those ones that realize, like, this too shall pass, and we've always got to be working on the next platform, the next horizon, and we've got to do that with the way that we're protecting ourselves from cultural lock-in. And the way you do that is through different social arrangements. There are times where you discover, there are times where you're trying to develop, and there are times where you're constantly diffusing and scaling ideas. And it's the cadence back and forth across those three that create enough degree of freedom that you minimize this concept of structural or cultural lock-in.
I've got a quick follow-up to that, and it's just such a great way to describe it, Michael. Thank you. So when you think about that cultural lock-in, and so here's the fundamental question. Do you think humans in general, especially humans that are in the workplace, are more inclined to maybe they feel more safety and stability in the idea of cultural lock-in, meaning like any given day when you wake up, like in general, and you're right, there's people who are comfortable with change and people that don't, but in general, as humans, are we more inclined to want to have things be consistent, or are we more inclined to want to push towards change? And because that feels very, I'm just guessing, broadly speaking, across humans, that feels a little maybe dangerous. You know what I mean? Because we don't know where it's going to go, so it takes a lot of confidence. So culturally, so what is like the reality in terms of what are humans fundamentally, and then how do we, as we build organizations and cultures, are we harnessing something better that's naturally there, or are we trying to change something in humans that isn't naturally there? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, this is where I blend science with personal experiences. And I will say that, first of all, as human beings, we're mostly hypocrites. And I'll put
First and
myself in
foremost.
that. I'll put myself in that category.
Yeah.
Like, to answer your question super directly, Pat, like, as long as I'm evoking the change, and it's, my idea or my in-group's ideas, and we're working on it, and it's very important that that's true for an idea to take hold. As long as I'm in that camp, like I'm in the entrepreneurial pocket, like I'm all for change. But when somebody's trying to mess with my thing, like, wait a minute, all of a sudden I become the most rigid person in the system. So we call that the founder's dilemma, right? Clayton Christensen spent years writing about this topic. So I think the short answer is it just depends. And I think that's why we've got to surround ourselves with people that challenge us all the time. I talk about this concept of the challenger in the book, and we hate challengers. But I know that if I don't have somebody challenging me, and if we don't intentionally think about how to build that into the organizational fabric, what happens is even the most innovative people become locked in on their thing. So that's the nuance of this. And that's why shifting these social arrangements frequently is so important, because even the people that invent the new future will become locked into their future, and the pattern repeats itself across time. And that's why adaptive space is so critical, because it's, you constantly got to oscillate back and forth from it. And another way of thinking about this is we spend lots of time talking about agility these days. There's been tons written on agility. I'm a huge agility geek, but we don't spend nearly enough time talking about stability. And it actually takes both for organizations to be successful. If you're only agile, that is living in chaos, and you've never really operationalized your ideas in such a way that you can scale them. But if you're only stable, or if you become too locked into stability, you don't enable the next set of activities to emerge. So it's this constant back and forth between stability and agility that really helps to create an ongoing, long-term, successful organization.
That's so insightful and so true. And I think so I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to have to keep us moving. We're going to run out of time. So I guess this leads me. So over the last 16 months, doing another kind of part of this conversation, we've gone through. Let me rephrase that. We've been forced to be responsive, to live an agility that we weren't quite prepared for, right? Organizations kind of went through a transformation that was dropped on their heads, and we survived it, but there's a lot of scars. So in the future, is creating an adaptive space also preparing your organization for this type of transformational change that's beyond your control? Because there's one thing, like, to go back to your Blockbuster example, it's a little more, the future's changing, but you believe in where you started as a business. You're going to continue to sort of reimagine yourself, but within the framework of just what you do. You're not ready to change. But so many organizations were forced to, even without a plan, to go through change and to really transform themselves. So does having an adaptive space and really embracing that philosophy prepare organizations to be more stable when the shit hits the fan? No, sorry for the language, but
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
It's you're probably going to notice a pattern in the way that I answer these questions at this point, but it's a little bit of both, right? I think a lot about the different words that we've used so far, and you've got to really parse them out and be very specific about what you're leaning into and what you're trying to drive. There are times where organizations need to be incredibly responsive, and for me, what's responsive? Something happened. The world's completely unpredictable. We don't know what's going to happen. We can't predict everything in this era, right? And and the velocity of what the world, how the world's operating is just accelerating so much that we can't always be super thoughtful about how we will react in a predictive manner, proactive manner. So responsiveness is really critical. Like something happens, you better respond, and you better be willing to give up on the best decision or the best solution, because even the best solution tomorrow may be a failure. So you've got to respond. Speed is super important in today's world. And I think this degree of responsiveness is really, really important. I think of adaptation and responsiveness as like clones to one another. They're responsive. They're more reactive. You might call them defensive postures if you prefer. But then I think of agility as being the antidote to them. And that's the proactive element of this, right? Agility is really about learning and iteration so that the next time you see this, you know how to respond. So it's almost like you got to think of agility and adaptation combined and not just think of one or the other. If you're constantly responding, then you lose the ability to control your own destiny. If you're only doing agility, then you might not be able to operate with the speed and responsiveness that you need whenever shit happens. So it's this combination of both, speed, learning, iteration, agility, sort of preemptively, adaptation and responsiveness, sort of, in a reactive mode that sort of makes this work. I know that's super nuanced, but it's really important, and that's why you need a little bit of both.
Yeah, what I like about that approach is it's just sort of a fundamental way of thinking, and right, because we can never anticipate what's going to be happening, whether it's a direct threat within an industry or at a macro level, like what we've been through over the last 14 months where everybody's affected by it. So those fundamentals are those things that help us guide through, play to our strengths, but also prepare us for things that we can't control. So I've got a follow-on question, and Dan, if I'm jumping us ahead too much, I apologize, because I know you've got the outline. But what have we learned? I know you've done some research around this sort of, and I saw some comments come in too, in terms of how people connect and work. So much of your work is about it's really about organizational design, how people connect. You've got your 4Ds. I really love the way you've described how, ideas sort of move through from, new ideas, and they get brokered, and then you develop them in a sort of a group setting, and then you really try and transmit them throughout the organization and eventually start to bring them into scale. But in this hybrid world we're in now, where we're learning a lot about how teams are working, both either 100% virtually and soon much more hybrid. What are you starting to learn about how this idea works in this hybrid situation? Does this work more to our advantage? Or my guess is you're probably going to have a very nuanced way of thinking about this as well. But I'd love how you're describing this, because everyone's trying to think, what have we learned in the last 14 months, and how are we taking these ideas forward, hopefully, into this new hybrid world in a smart way?
Yeah, at least you're seeing the pattern, right? That
that's great. I love it.
Maybe I'll set a little bit of context for your listeners first, and then dive into like this really strange experiment that we've all been engaged in over the last 14 months. Just to go back to the 4Ds for a moment, we constantly need to be discovering new ideas, right? And that requires a different set of connections, bridge connections, I'll call them. And that means that we need to reduce insularity inside of an organization. We need to work across groups. We need to be working inside and outside of the organization. A good friend of mine, Sandy Pentland, up at the MIT Media Lab, suggests that the more bridge connections you have, the more insights you have. And his research suggests up to 25% more insights with a healthy set of bridge connections. But the next motion is, how do you develop something? So ideas are cheap. At some point, we got to bring them into the world, right? Nobody pays for ideas. They pay for product. They pay for solutions. So at some point, you got to manifest that. You got to bring that into reality. By the way, those discovery connections actually get in the way of building something. This is where agile methodology, at Amazon, we call them small 2-pizza teams, build teams, very cohesive, small, high trust, maybe 8-9 people lock themselves in a room and build something, rapid iteration, and they build a product. However, the problem is, like, now I've got an idea, I've got a pocket of ideas, that are ready to go live, but I've got to scale it because it needs marketing support, it needs finance support, it needs a budget, it needs all these other things. It needs to be manufactured if it's a product, sold if it's a service. So the next thing you got to do is diffuse it, and that requires more bridge connections. So you go from bridging to cohesion or bonding connections to bridging connections to diffuse it, and then the combination of those three really help to create disruption. That's context, Pat, really to get to your core question. What we found out when we entered into this grand experiment is that surprisingly, and I think this was a surprise for almost everybody, productivity went up. We went virtual and productivity went up. And I bet you if you would have, I don't know that anyone did this, but I bet you if you were to ask the individual leaders, what do you think is going to happen if we all went virtual starting tomorrow? We didn't know we were going virtual tomorrow, so nobody had the foresight that I know of to ask that question. But I bet you would have had far more people saying productivity will drop than go up, but it didn't. And in fact, in almost all cases, it went up with knowledge workers at least. One of the reasons for that is because that's based on what we call bonding social capital. That means you can produce in your small team, very much like you build. So productivity looks very similar in the network to building a new product. Your closest, and this is what the statistics said almost immediately when we went into the virtual work, is that our closest relationships actually increased. Our number of contacts actually went up 15% with our 5 closest work colleagues, in the first 3, 4, or 5 months after COVID. But you can almost guess where I'm going to go next. That's the equivalent of development, right, or productivity. But the other thing that happened in the very same time period was our bridging connections eroded immensely. Ron Burt's work basically suggests this. Our bridge connections are more fragile. Those are the connections you have to other teams, from team to team or outside of the org. They dropped precipitously, almost 30% in the first couple months. So what that means is, discovery and diffusion begin to erode. And where do we see the first pain points whenever we were virtual? How quickly can people scale product? Just take the video game industry. Launches were delayed. Why? Because human beings weren't together. Bridge connections eroded, and all of a sudden our ability to get ideas out of pockets where they're sub-optimized and scaled began to erode. And then the other part of that, and we've got great sentiment from across all kinds of different companies, the other thing that dried up was idea generation. And I still don't think we've seen the full effect of either of those. But I think it gets to the point of, so what? Like, what should we do? If we can be productive, shouldn't we stay virtual? And the answer is, there's a little bit in between, right? There are times where we need to bring human beings back together because we got to reforge those relationships so that we can continually discover and continually diffuse or get the ideas scaled on across the organization. So I personally believe and have been doing a ton of work on what's the right sweet spot between, virtual and face-to-face interactions. And there are years and years of deep research. Like, we are still human beings and we are social creatures. This is a poor substitute for what it would be like if we're in the room. It takes somewhere between 3 to 5 more iterations for us to earn the same level of trust in a virtual setting as it does if we were locked in a room together. That's just a reality. Like, that's just how we act as human beings. So you can do it. That's the good news. But you got to be far more intentional virtually. A much better way is to bring people together periodically in very intentional ways. When you're trying to discover, be intentional about who you want to discover from. Think about how to build serendipity. Another good friend, Ben Waber's work says that just 1 to 2 days back in the office increases serendipity by up to 25%. So some combination, and I haven't even gotten into like different job tasks and which makes this really complex, but some combination of these social arrangements and connections with a great degree of intentionality is growingly more important than ever. And I believe that like we have fast forward, we will look back on this time and say to ourselves, we have fast forwarded the future work, somewhere between 5 to 10 years forward, because we all learned a ton, but we gotta leverage those learnings, right? It's a little bit like agility. We got to learn from this experience, and then we've got to decide how are we going to lean into different patterns and different approaches moving forward.
That's great. And Dan, I was just going to jump in fast and then I'll hand the mic
Yeah,
back over
yeah.
to you. But I love your term serendipity. As you were describing that, I was thinking, I mean, from my own personal perspective, how, in some ways this has been a great time for me as a kind of entrepreneur and a thinker this last 14 months to be able to just have time and space to be able to think through ideas, research ideas. There's a real advantage to that. But the other thing I've learned for myself as a creator and entrepreneur is that serendipity is such a big part of it. So when I'm out moving through the world randomly, when I met like my wife is a dancer, so I go and see a lot of performance art and dance art. And oftentimes when I'm in a completely different place in space and my brain's being challenged, like the ideas go off, and those we're missing that randomness, that serendipity, not only within the workplace itself, but in our lives. And that's where those kind of big kind of aha moments come. And I think that's where a lot of breakthroughs come. But anyway, I just thank you for those insights that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I love that. So something that I take away from that is, and I love the 4D. So discovery, development, diffusion, disruption. And everybody, I'm going to make sure you check out this book, by the way. It's really, really remarkable. So I will make sure we send a link out before we leave the call. I call it a call. It's my old school. But so it would be fair to say that discovery and idea generation probably started to drop because we were hitting a level of fatigue and exhaustion because we were focused on stabilizing, right? I mean, I think that to me, that is probably one core takeaway last 14 months. So with that, if we agree with that, then we would say, well, once we start getting people back in to the office with intentional reasons, intentional focus, let's bring teams together when they need to be together. Let's not bring people back just to bring them back. Let's make sure it's much more focused and intentional. Because I think it's dangerous to say, well, ideas only happen when we're together, right? I think it's ideas didn't happen because we were focused on stability, right? I mean, and let me pause there to see if you think that's somewhat of a true statement.
I think that's true. I think I can flip the question and say, here's when we know ideas don't happen, when we become incredibly insular, when we start to shut off the conduit of discovery and become incredibly insular. And I think inadvertently, exactly to your point, Dan, that's what happened during this time period. Teams started to lock in, they became focused. And perhaps the thing that scares me most about this period of time is who became most focused, and that would be leaders. So where the bridge connections really began to erode the most was with our leaders inside of organizations, which primarily are the bridging, not in every organization, but they represent about 50% of our bridges in most cases inside of an organization. If you think about it, leaders tend to work across teams by their very structural position, but they became very focused in on their organization or their team for all the right reasons, right? Or is my team okay? Yes. Deeply empathetic. Is everyone okay? I have to check in. And they became focused on the right things, but the side effect became insularity. And now what we've got to do is start to think about how do we reforge some of those bridges. And I think I'm less concerned about, ideas are there, and certainly you can't predict when an idea emerges. Like no one can predict serendipity. All we can do is create the right conditions that are more likely for serendipity to emerge. And for me, the right conditions are create better bridge connections, both inside and outside of the organization. And then discovery will begin to flow. And discovery is kind of like the lifeblood of agility, if you really think about it. So I would be very concerned if we had to do another year of this experiment, we would see some long-term consequences on the innovation front, not to mention all the other things like, health and well-being.
And one thing that we talk about, the opportunities and I think the shiny gems that came out of this very difficult period that we went through was people did rise to the occasion, and there became a focus on, loving more and caring more, and truly empty words like empathy and humility had a real meaning in the workplace, where they were sort of passing thoughts before. So our challenge, and I think this is a nice way to, as we kind of take this out, is to think about, let's not move away from that, because we don't want to sort of go back to the workplace and say, well, that was the time to be empathetic and care more, but now we got to get back to just work as usual. But how do we, to leverage what you've been saying all along, is how do we balance this, right? It's kind of in the middle. How do we learn what to care more and to be more responsive as a leader, but also to get back to some of those fundamental, structural relationships and bridges that we need in order to ignite creativity and to ignite ideation, still with the purpose of caring for your people and taking care of them and giving them a voice.
Yeah, I'm actually super long and optimistic that that's going to happen. I mean, my grand concern would be that we snap back to the way it was before, and everyone goes, glad that's over. Let's go back to the way things were. That's not how an agile organization would respond. An agile organization would learn from such an experience. I think our real benefit, which is why I'm not overly concerned about snapback, is the people now know a different way, right? And that genie's left the bottle. People like working virtually. They like being in the office at times. And I think the human beings have discovered something different about themselves. And it's, you don't get that back in the bottle. You can't contain that. So I'm very hopeful that part of it's going to continue to drive progress for us as we think about new future models of how to work. And I think that's true for leaders as well. Like, I think, once you've experienced empathy, it replicates itself over time.
It feels good.
And I generally believe that, like, we are all, I forget what it's being called right now, but, it's this sort of existential self-evaluation, that people are going through right now about what's my purpose, what's my life's work. And, I think that, these punctuated equilibrium moments cause us to think about things differently. So I'm super long about the future. I think the human beings won't allow us to snap back. One of my favorite stories is to talk about, and I think I did this in the book as well, a little bit about Napster, like the Napster phenomenon. And Napster introduced something to us like, hey, you can get a single song and not have to buy this $17 compact disc for the one song that you like. I think we're a little bit like in that period of time with work. You can come back, you could try to snap back like the recording studios did and start to file all these patent infringement lawsuits and everything else. But the reality is people discovered a new thing, and they're going to find a way to continue to propagate that new thing. And you could be like Apple and leap on to that new thing and figure out how to flow with it, or you could snap back and meet your demise as well. Sounds pretty detrimental. I didn't mean it to sound that gloom, but you get my point. Like, human beings have discovered a new way, and that just propels us into a new future in a different way. It's completely unpredictable. Like, I would be guessing as much as you about what that could look like, but and I don't know, but I'm super optimistic that the way we work together is going to look very different in the next couple of years than what it did 5 years ago.
Well, we promised this show's about optimism and learning something. That was a mic drop. Thank you. I hopefully I'm so many comments. Gene, thank you. I'm going to read this out loud. I rarely make it through a complete webinar, but this was so interesting and important. Thank you. And thank you, Michael, for the work you do, the optimism you brought today, and just the focus you bring to this important topic. And keep doing what you're doing. We really appreciate your time. And Pat put a link up to adaptivespace.net in the chat, so everyone check it out. And
thanks, guys.
Wonderful day.
Being radical. Keep being radical.
Yes,
we're trying.
We will try.
We can't help it.
We can't help it. People like you on our show. We will be. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.
See you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good day.